This week, Minions The Rise of Gru opens in theaters, and though it will still be about another week or so before I see it, on account of I'm on vacation when you're watching this, I'm filming this video ahead of time, it got me thinking, between this new Minions movie, which is an origin story about Gru, Lightyear, releasing a couple weeks ago, being an origin story about Buzz Lightyear, and the Star Wars Cassian Andor series releasing on Disney Plus next month, there's no shortage of origin story prequels this year. So today I'm giving you my picks for my top 10 origin story prequel movies. In order for a movie to qualify for this list, it has to be a movie that tells the origin story of a character introduced in another film in the franchise. So most superhero movies like Iron Man, Spider-Man, and Man of Steel won't be on this list, because those are movies where you're meeting the character for the first time, or they're retelling the origin story that you already knew from another film. However, if the character had a movie about them, but their origin story was not told in that film, and then they went back and rebooted the franchise or made a movie about the character to tell that character's story, it counts. So with those rules in mind, let's get started. Number 10, Puss in Boots. After absolutely stealing the show in Shrek 2, followed by some somewhat rocky follow-ups, Puss in Boots finally gets his own origin story. The film shows how he started out as an orphan and was then betrayed by somebody he thought was his friend, and decided to turn from a life of crime to helping others. The film is energetic, funny, and has some creative elements to it, like making the villains of the film, Jack and Jill, a sort of this Bonnie and Clyde outlaw duo. The film is very reminiscent of westerns and heist films and is a ton of fun. Number 9, Oz the Great and Powerful. Even though there are literally hundreds of Wizard of Oz stories, the wizard story was only briefly mentioned in the original film. All we learn about him is that, like Dorothy, he came from Kansas, and even though he's just an ordinary man, was somehow able to convince an entire land that he was a wizard. And this is the movie telling that story. The movie keeps the tone of the Oz stories pretty well, and it's an enjoyable movie with fun characters. But I'm not really a fan of what they did to the Wicked Witch of the West by making her a sympathetic villain and giving her a failed romance with the wizard. Those decisions were kind of silly, but as an origin story about the Wizard of Oz character, it's still pretty fun. Number 8, Snake Eyes G.I. Joe Origins. I do have a few problems with this film, mainly the same problems I have with XMen Origins Wolverine, where it tries to introduce a whole bunch of other characters from the franchise as potential spin-off movies, instead of focusing mostly on the main character. But it's still pretty good. Henry Golding is very charming in the film and gives a fun performance, and while the story is a little bit cliche and does play out a little bit like X-Men Origins, where it's sort of this getting revenge or getting justice for somebody who was killed story, it has a lot of great action to make up for it and is a worthy film for the coolest character in G.I. Joe. Number 7, Solo, a Star Wars Story. Ron Howard's take on Star Wars is a fantastic throwback to the original trilogy era with a great cast of characters who are all very likable, all played by actors that give great performances. Alden Ehrenreich really does feel like a young Han Solo, Donald Glover was perfectly cast as young Lando, and making it a heist movie mixed with a western really captures the spirit of Star Wars. I know a lot of people have their problems with it, but I enjoy it. Number 6, Cruella. Unlike a certain other Disney villain origin movie which tried to make the villain sympathetic, this movie was smart by keeping the villain a villain, serving more as a cautionary tale about revenge. Neither Cruella nor Emma Thompson's character, the Baroness, are characters you can root for because they're both terrible people, and the film delves deep into themes of mental illness and nature versus nurture. It's pretty bold and dark for a Disney movie, but also still has this sort of fun Ocean's 11 feel to it. It's definitely the least Disney-like thing Disney's put out regarding one of their characters, and that's why it works, as both an origin story and a cautionary tale. Number 5, Wonder Woman. After sharing a few brief scenes with the Caped Crusader and Man of Steel and Batman v Superman Dawn of Justice, we finally learned the origin of Wonder Woman in this film. It has fantastic action, some great fish-out-of-water comedy, and a story that raises questions about mankind and their ability for both good and bad. And while the villain is kinda weak, mainly due to poor casting, it's still a fantastic superhero movie and origin story. Number 4, Rise of the Planet of the Apes. Spoiler alert for the original Planet of the Apes from 1967. Fast forward if you don't want to know the twist ending of that film. In the original Planet of the Apes, we think these astronauts have landed on a planet entirely populated by highly intelligent apes who have enslaved mankind, but it turns out it was Earth the whole time, and the apes evolved, which allowed them to take over. How this happened is never explained in the original film, and this film makes up its own version of what could have happened. Now, all the films in this prequel trilogy are fantastic, but I chose the first one because it's the first in the series leading into the other ones. Having the apes' intelligence be from a super drug was a really smart story choice. And then in the later films, Having mankind being wiped out by a disease from the apes and going to war with them brings new context to the original. These films have compelling characters, it's both good and bad on both the human and ape side, and the story is fantastic. Number 3, X-Men First Class. After X-Men Origins Wolverine bombed at the box office, it was hated by both critics and audiences. Plans for the other X-Men Origins films were cancelled, which means we never got to see films about Gambit or Cyclops. However, the script for X-Men Origins Magneto, which was planned to be the next film in the series, was almost done. So they took what they had and reworked it to be an origin story for both Magneto and Charles Xavier. The film tells a great story of their evolution, no pun intended, from enemies to friends, and is also very unique in the world of comic book movies as it takes place in the 1960s during the Cuban Missile Crisis, so it gives the film a spy aesthetic similar to The Incredibles. The downfall of Magneto is well developed as you see him become the very type of person he hates. All the new characters introduced are all pretty cool, and it's one of the best films in the franchise. Number 2, Star Wars Episode 3, Revenge of the Sith. Technically, I could have put any of the prequel trilogy films on this list, but the reason I chose Revenge of the Sith is because in the somewhat clunky prequel trilogy, it's the least bad of them, or at least the most watchable. It serves as a nice parallel to Return of the Jedi, which was about the redemption of Anakin Skywalker, by having this be about the downfall of Anakin and his transformation into Darth Vader. The film very much feels like a Shakespearean tragedy, as we see Anakin betray everyone around him for the sake of gaining power. It's arguably the darkest Star Wars film, and that's why it works, because it's so tragic. Because after all, this is an origin story about one of the greatest villains in the history of cinema. And coming in at number 1 is Batman Begins. Batman's origin up to this point was only briefly touched on before this film, but in the other Batman films, he's already been Batman for quite a while, whereas this film, we meet him when he's still Bruce Wayne, still learning how to be the vigilante. The film has a fantastic script dealing with themes of fear and how to deal with it for both good and bad. It has a more grounded, serious take after the last couple of Batman films were kind of campy, and the darker, grittier tone works, borrowing quite a bit from Batman the Animated Series, while also being an entirely fresh take on the character with a new way of telling the origin story. And that's why it comes in at number 1. I'm going to share your favorite origin story prequel movies, and I will see you next time.